Afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking around to the final and closing session of this wonderful symposium. I'd first like to thank Veronica Vargas for inviting all of us and for putting together such a great day-long session, which I think was quite intellectually stimulating. And hopefully we can try to flesh out some of these ideas or some of these parts of the presentations that the people talked about earlier, which we might have some tension about or have some deep inner, something that needs to be aired out, because I feel like there must be something. And I don't want to talk because we have such a diverse and esteemed panel of guests. And I'd also like to comment that our panel, I believe, is superior to the last panel because we have 2 female representatives as opposed to the last panel, which were 6 dudes. Trying to talk about medicine and innovation in Latin America. Let me just introduce myself. My name is Jing. I'm a general internist by training, so I think I'm probably the only physician in this room currently who practices clinical medicine. I'm also a researcher at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. So my faculty appointment is at Harvard Medical School, and I study drug use in large populations and U.S. Pharmaceutical policy and prescription drug pricing. I do have an interest in Latin America as well, so that's why I think Veronica had asked me to be on this panel. And I've not met any of our panelists before today, so what I'd like them to do individually is one by one to introduce yourself, and then also talk about what motivated you to come speak to us today about this topic, and limit your entire speech to less than 5 minutes, because I want to leave as much time for questions as possible. So maybe we can start with Ken at the bottom.
Oh, wow. I was expecting to go last. I thought I was going to be the closing whole show. My name's Ken Shadlen. I'm a political scientist at the London School of Economics, and I've been working for the last 10 or 15 years or so on issues having to do with the politics of intellectual property, but particularly around pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical patents. What motivated me to come here is actually I knew I was going to be in New England at Brown over the weekend or last week working with a colleague on a totally different topic, and then I saw that Veronica was organizing this. So I said, I'd like to come to your conference, and she said, sure, you can come and you could speak in the closing panel. So here I am. So I'll speak less than 5 minutes. I'll be brief. Thank you, and thanks for having me, and I learned a lot today. So I think when we talk about access to medicines, we're talking about 3 different things, or there's 3 different elements of what our conversation's about. We need new drugs. So we talk about what are the incentives for the creation of new drugs. We talk about sort of what are the terms on which we access the new drugs. So it's not just good enough to have them, but on what price are people able to use them. And we talk about sort of access to older drugs where intellectual property is not part of the story, what the panel before lunch was about. I think those 3 things are different. I want to say a few words about each of them through the lens of patents, which is what I've spent most of my career working on. I want to remind people that while we think that patents are the lifeblood of, we can't imagine a world without them, that pharmaceutical patenting is actually brand new, that 40 or 45 years ago, if you had a new drug, you could get a patent on it in exactly 4 countries, the US, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, and that was it. Nowhere else on the planet Earth could you get a pharmaceutical patent. Then starting in the mid-1970s, Japan, the rest of Western Europe, and then eventually with the TRIPS agreement, bring in, basically now you can get a pharmaceutical patent anywhere in the world except for the really poor countries. It's new. And so it's a new phenomenon. And the reason why I'm making that point is not just to remind us that this thing that we think the world could never live without, well, the world always lived without until fairly recently, is that we're actually still living in a transition period. The effects of universal pharmaceutical patenting are yet to really be felt. And the reason why I say that is that even when countries started introducing drug patents, they started introducing them in very different ways with different time periods. And a key country here, for example, is India. So India didn't start introducing patents until 2005. And because of the way India introduced patents, nothing that was invented prior to 1995 is or ever will be patented in India. So many of the conversations that we've been having for the last 15 years about drug patents are in the context of this transitional issue. I'll give you two examples. One is there was a presentation this morning about imatinib and how the Thai government threatened a compulsory license on it, but they didn't need to actually issue it. Well, they didn't need to actually issue it, but they had a credible threat because imatinib is a 1993 drug, not in terms of when it was launched, but in terms of when it was invented. So it wasn't patented in India, so there was a source of supply there. So the Thai government could threaten Novartis with the compulsory license, and there wasn't a single supplier. Likewise, efavirenz, which came up in the Brazil case, that was a drug that basically didn't have a patent in India. So the Brazilian government could negotiate with Merck, but there was a credible source of supply. As eventually, all the new drugs are going to be patented in India as well. And all the new drugs will be patented in Thailand, and all new drugs will be patented in Brazil, and so on. Eventually, this mechanism, this threat of introducing competition, which Carlos, I think, says very rightly is essential, this threat is will be a less credible threat in a world of single suppliers. And so I think with the full effects of what the world is going to look like is something we're a long way there from. I was asked to speak for less than 5 minutes, and I want to say one last thing, which is that what the challenge is going to be in a world of pharmaceutical patents, in a world in which you expect most drugs to have one patent, at least on the base molecule, the base compound in each country, is not to allow the proliferation of lots of additional patents. And that's where the differences are. So I think it might have been in Veronica's presentation about it's the efforts to extend patents. Countries, the new challenge is going to be, now that we live in a world in which there is going to be a pharmaceutical patent, so the drug's going to have a period of exclusivity, is what countries could do to make sure those periods of exclusivity end when they're supposed to end, and not 3 years later or 4 years later. And then once they end, to expedite generic competition, to make sure that when it's possible legally for there only be one competitor, more than one player in the market, there really is, in de facto, more than one player in the market. And I think those are the big challenges that lie ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Tatiana.
Great. Hi, my name is Tatiana Andia. I work at the Universidad Los Andes in Bogota. And I've also, for many years now, advised the Minister of Health on issues of pharmaceutical policy. So the reason why I'm here and want to talk is basically maybe three messages, and three messages based both on my research but also on the difficult exercise of trying to advise a country on how to control and make sustainable pharmaceutical policy. So one is that, and I think this is happening already, we probably should stop talking about the rich and the poor, in the sense that, first of all, access is becoming an issue that is also an issue in developed countries, and that is, of course, more evident now with, like the hepatitis C and the very expensive cancer treatments that are going to be difficult to pay also for the US and for Europe. But also, we should stop talking about research and development of diseases for the poor that are also developed in poor countries. And in that sense, I completely agree with Dr. Carlos Gadella that maybe developing countries can also pitch in the development of cancer and, like rheumatoid arthritis and so on diseases. But then there's two other reasons why I feel that I should talk about this. One is harmonization, regulatory harmonization. And there, I would like to suggest that we should have a cautionary measure. And that is maybe too much harmonization on regulation could become a technical barrier for competition. And I think there's a lot of politics on the way we decide how to define regulatory harmonizations, and we should think about that. And I'm going to give two examples of how that works. And then the third one is, let's not forget about our regular trade barriers to competition, and then I'm going to give two examples of that as well. So for the harmonization of regulation, my example is an attempt that Colombia made to regulate biotech drugs, and in particular biosimilar drugs, a few years ago. And so the summary is we received a letter from the FDA, then a second letter from the FDA, then perhaps a third letter from the FDA. At the end, we ended up meeting with the FDA to explain to the FDA why Colombia wanted to regulate biosimilars with a flexible understanding in terms of clinical trials that is now mostly exactly what the EMA is doing. The last guideline by the EMA is exactly the same as the Colombian decree, but at the time, apparently the evidence was not there and so on. But the question is why Colombia has to meet with the FDA to justify a decision that in theory is a decision that is completely autonomous, made by a country. If you want to risk your population, you should be able to do it, right? No, you have to meet with the FDA. And we also received a letter by Joe Biden, just in case you're interested. In the general and regular trade barriers, I just want to give two examples. The most recent one is a decree that we issued only a couple of months ago to regulate prices based on value, so a value-based pricing regulation. And that's something that the French have been doing, that the Germans have been doing, that everyone is now doing, right? But guess who we had to meet to, basically negotiate every paragraph with not the FDA, not the USTR, but pharma. Why pharma? Because Colombia wants to get accession to the OECD. And in order for the US to give us the approval for the OECD accession, we need to basically meet with pharma. So the USTR said, please do negotiate the text of that decree with pharma so that the US can give you the approval, right? And so let's see what happens, because basically on the 27th of April, they will give us their final answer, whether we have or not. So maybe we will be in the OECD after this. But we had to negotiate a sovereign decree with pharma in order to get accession to the OECD. So this is just to bring politics back in, right? We are talking about access to medicines as if politics were not here. And there's a lot of politics in restricting competition, because competition is about profits, and we can't forget about that. So that's it.
Thank you very much. I think Colombia is in good hands with this lady. I really think so.
Thank you.
Much better than the jokesters we have at USTR. Maybe Mohammed could go next.
All right, thank you so much. So my name is Mohammed Zaman. I'm professor of biomedical engineering and also global health at Boston University. And I'm going to take a perspective that is slightly different, and that is not going to focus on sort of the trade or the economics, but the issue of quality. This issue keeps coming up. I think there is a global recognition of universal health care. However, that is meaningless unless there is quality associated with that health care. And oftentimes the discussion is centered around Africa when it comes to substandard and counterfeit medicines, two different terms, but often used together, and Latin America is often forgotten. But that doesn't mean that the problem doesn't exist there. The problem is quite acute. Some of the data, there's not a lot of data, points to anywhere from 10 to 25% of the medicines not meeting the basic quality cuts. So the question becomes, how do you ensure after all of these things are done in terms of good trade and sort of patents that you maintain a certain level of quality? So I want to talk about three things. The first is, what is the incentive to quality? And that is oftentimes both a question of incentive and a question of disincentive. We know that the regulatory structures in Latin America, as in many other parts of the world, are fairly ad hoc. So the first time somebody makes a mistake, quote unquote, the penalty is, non-existent. The testing, the regular testing, even in countries like Brazil, is minimal. So that means that there is a widespread proliferation of poor quality medicines, and you would have sort of medicines of varying quality operating in the market at different times. The poorer the communities, the challenge that exists, and that contributes to issues such as antimicrobial resistance that is a problem globally. So that is the issue. So incentives to quality for both substandard and counter medicines. The second issue is the cost of quality. How do you create a quality mechanism, and who pays for that? So for example, CIPLA now has an increasing presence in Latin America, in Brazil, and Colombia, and CIPLA is known for relatively better quality drugs than many of the other generic manufacturers. The cost of that, according to CIPLA, is about $5 million a year per country in terms of maintaining a certain quality standard. Now, if you're a smaller generic farm, you may not be willing to pay that, knowing that you'll never get caught, right? So how do you sort of create a mechanism where the cost of quality is absorbed in these structures? The third issue that I care about is both quality in and within country. So when the drugs arrive at the point of customs, how often are they tested beyond sort of brand counterfeiting? So somebody can say whether company X made it or not, but what if that company X itself is not making good quality drugs? And that often happens not only in Latin America, but in South Asia and Africa. And then sort of within the country as well, because when the APIs come in, they are never really tested for quality, right? So you may test the finished product, but not the various components that make that, and there are different rules for that. For example, API usually fall under chemicals, whereas the final product falls under sort of a finished pharmaceutical. So there are different rules for that. And finally, the issue of extremely porous regulatory structures. So most regulatory systems often work with self-reporting or sort of testing of drugs that are supplied by new registrations or new manufacturers, but not necessarily random sampling within country, which means that if there is a bad medicine that is there for quite some time, that doesn't get caught. And we know that people often wouldn't attribute an adverse reaction with a bad medicine. They would say that somebody's already sick or they've already died, but they wouldn't say that this happened because of poor quality medicines. That only happens when there is this major spike in the number of people, a lot of people dying over a very short period of time. The concept of autopsy or postmortem is not very common. It's also expensive. Somebody has to pay for it. So these things often get ignored. So I think one of the things that I care about and often gets lost in the conversation on pharmaceuticals is how do you ensure, so how do you create quality, how do you incentivize quality, and how do you maintain quality over a long period of time?
Thank you, Mohammed. Yuly.
Sure. Forgive my voice, I have a cold, so I'm gonna try to speak as
You got a microphone.
that will help. So can you hear me good in the back? Yes. I don't know if
Oh, it's
perfect. So you can hear
You
me.
should tell us that before that.
You can hear me now.
So everything she says, you say it.
It's wired.
Okay, so the question was why I'm here and the reason to kind of join this panel. I am from Chile originally. My background is in biomedical science. So I did my PhD here in Massachusetts, and then I specialize in economics of innovation, so technology, innovation, entrepreneurship. But being here as a good PhD candidate in the labs of Massachusetts, I realized that the ideas that are happening here weren't really far from the ideas that I was developing so many years ago, and I won't date myself, back in Chile. So with that in mind and that realization, along the years, at the same time, the government of Chile was creating a collaboration with the state of Massachusetts, which was a political agreement to say we are friends and we want to collaborate beyond the collaboration that Chile carries with the United States in science and technology. So they have done two agreements. One started in California that heavily developed the agricultural sector, both in California and Chile. And then it was the second state, Massachusetts, to be the second place regionally where the country could collaborate between the two. The question was in what to collaborate and why to collaborate, right? So a political agreement sounds pretty cool, and there is a lot of pictures and photos in the newspapers, but then after that, I don't know how much it happens. So I was approached by the government to take the challenge to understand how to execute and create a strategy around two economies that are pretty much complementary. And that led to the creation of a non-profit organization that is called Chile MAS, because MAS is more in English, so why not in Spanish? And this organization, it's taking advantage of the complementarity of the ecosystem development of the two regions, and particularly in the biomedical aspects. The science and technology that is being developed in Chile is pretty high quality. I mean, we had a previous panelist that is today developing vaccines and drugs. And given to my background, while working in my technology innovation policy program, I believe that ideas come from everywhere, so as many other philanthropic organizations that are good ideas. But ideas to prosper in the right ecosystem and the economical conditions need to be with the right peers, with the right conversation, with the right people. So basically what we did is to create this nonprofit that is creating an exchange between the two parties. And in the particular case of pharmaceutical, where we are today in this topic, is that all these scientists and people in the universities that is developing new drugs could have the opportunity to come over Massachusetts and take advantage of the Massachusetts ecosystem. Why is that a good thing? Why could it be different? Well, to talk about the new development of drugs in Chile particularly, and that's the case I can speak of, you need to have people in the table that can manage the conversation. We cannot really teletransport all of you down to Chile every day and have a good discussion about patents. It doesn't happen every day, and the scientists there is not their everyday thing. Here, you're in the lab, you go to the tech transfer office, you go to the patent lawyer, we have coffee, and then voila, you have a company. That doesn't happen in the Latin American countries. So at the same time, the economy of Chile doesn't have the budget to support the creation of new pharmaceutical companies. So $90 billion, that's, hello, we need to make new houses and to have at least a good health system. So this model now is being in the piloting stage. The idea is to collaborate with all the institutions, both in Massachusetts and Chile. We got seed funding from the government of Chile to start creating and developing the strategy. So here I am, sharing that idea and learning more about you and how can we think in the pharmaceuticals of the future. So that's me.
Thank you very much. Arturo.
Yeah. Well, this is very funny to have this microphone, which is fake, so one says, okay, now everybody is going to listen to me, especially by Veronica, who happens to have a call. Okay, my name is Arturo Schweigner. We met with Veronica like 25 years ago, studying at Boston University. And nowadays, I'm a director of a master course in Argentina for the last 20 years also. And it happens that I have the opportunity to be in Washington meeting people from the FDA 4 years ago. And then also we've been to Rio de Janeiro to the Fiocruz Foundation, visiting Biomanguinhos and other things of Fiocruz. So for me, today has been a very... I learned a lot in this experience. My main points are the presentation of Anita Wagner was very interesting. Mainly one of the questions at the very end, where there was a discussion of how the multinational industry of the pharma industry fix the markups. And that is something that comes once and once again, especially in the case of the hepatitis C, where suddenly an enterprise buys another one for $11,000 million, and then in 1 year, 2014, Gilead sells products for another $1,000. So there is no research over there. It's just a big company who buys a small company who develop a bioproduct. So this thing really was a very strong point in Spain, where there was a lot of discussion because they have a price fixed for this product for $84,000 for each patient. And they estimated something like 1 million patients for a country of 44 million. So there was for me, there is a thing in stake, how to price the new products in the industry globally. So the story, the second point is what happens in our countries. For example, we had two very good presentations about Brazil, and mainly Brazil talks about the relation between the public sector, which is particularly strong in production of medicine, and the very successful alliance with the private sector. But that is one case. Brazil, as my friend Google says, has nowadays something about 200 million people. Then comes Mexico, who has something about 127, and obviously the States has 323 million people. This is a sort of category of countries where we can really study very nice economics, where the markets work, where there are a lot of enterprise, where you do have economies of scale. In countries like Argentina, 43 million inhabitants, Colombia, 49, and Venezuela, 31, things are particularly different. The markets are not perfect. The markets are smaller, and if you have one or two companies which are an oligopoly of the market, then things are different. So I think that we have to make some difference in Latin America. The second issue in this case is related with FDA. Everybody refers to FDA as, you know, the science, the maximum truth in the approval of the pharma products. The two times I have the opportunity to talk with them at PAHO, by the way, the people over there talk us about the fast track, that they have developed fast track for the pharma industry. And when we finished the talk, we really didn't have the impression that that was really scientific, but that was much more oriented to the need of the pharma than to the need of the population and what we listened before in the previous panel. Finally, the point of patents and the new development in Argentina it's very difficult to implement because we have a large industry that provide employment for 120,000 people and is exporting something about $500 million and importing another $1,500 million. But it's a very important industry and is one of the key industries of the country. So and they have developed, some of them, let's say 25%, are doing some research in biosimilarity, similars, but most of them started with an old story of making copies. So there is a lot of work to do over there to put them into new developments and to work for the developed patents. But I agree with Ken when he said something that this is a new story and there are a lot of countries where there is not in use the patents as a gold rule. So this is my approach to this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience, please. Yeah.
Hi. I have a question for Ken to see, and then a comment about the quality issues that were mentioned in the conversation. Thank you very much for putting the panelist perspective. I think it's a good thing to look at this further. One thing we are observing, especially for middle-income countries, that now in addition to patents, which are starting now to becoming an issue, they have been an issue for a while, but I agree with you, I've mentioned exponentially, is the commercial agreements between private innovative companies and private generic companies that limit the commercialization of generics, that actually non-patented generics, but some of these companies that have received the transfer technology and doesn't want to sell it in a country that doesn't have the patent are precluded from doing that from this private-to-private agreement. We've experienced this in a very worrisome way in Latin America. I was wondering if this is something you see around the world, and we can have an idea from the patent perspective if what to do about it. And then I would like to comment, obviously, maybe we have a different perspective. I come from the Pan American organization. I did a presentation on quality and regulatory system and the evaluation. I think there is a perception that it's obviously, that there's a lack of regulatory enforcement and oversight in Latin America. Data will prove otherwise, and actually the evaluation that we've done in most of the regulatory systems in Latin America, especially the big manufacturer countries, showed that they are functional and up to par with, and actually are more active now in collaboration with Health Canada, with FDA, with Europe, in a equal basis. And from here I'm leading to a meeting of the 8 regulatory authorities of reference in Chile, which include Health Canada, Chile, US, Cuba, and they all sit and talk like equals. So I think we should be very careful by dismissing whole markets and regulatory system, because for many years Latin America, especially some of the countries, have had very good successes, eliminated some diseases prevented by vaccines. That actually shows that the vaccines that are used in the countries are of good quality, have advanced access to medicines that are now being exported, as we heard before, registered in FDA, which I think for some people are the benchmark. So what I cause is a word of caution, not do a generalization. Of course, there's a lot of markets that are still very weak, but I wouldn't say that that's especially for the major population centers, that's the rule. Thank you.
So before you guys start, Mohammed, just to give you some background, she talked a little bit about PAHO's voluntary tool that was used to assess different national regulatory agencies throughout Latin America, and they were graded from tiers 1 through 4 on a variety of different data sources, from whether they did bioequivalence testing to...
There are 530 indicators that they get evaluated.
Right.
With the whole suite. So
yes.
It's quite a gruesome testing, and done by peers, including peers from what I call ex-ICH, because now ICH is larger. So countries.
So while you chew on that, I'll let maybe Ken answer the first question. And please restate in your own words what that question was, because I don't think I got 100% of it.
So
I
think the question that Analia was asking was that there are across, in all countries, there are agreements that are made between the originator firm, whose patent is about to expire, and the follow-on firm, the generic firm, who wants to enter the market. In the US, we call those pay for delay, but they're usually some sort of agreement in which I give you something and then you hold off for a little while, and it's a way of sharing the rents that come from the exclusivity for a little bit longer. That's the question.
Yeah, and actually it goes, for example, some of the big Indian companies, Mylan, et cetera, are paid by the innovator of some of the ARV drugs not to even go to Latin America from countries that do not have the patent.
Right.
So even if you don't have the patent, you cannot sell atazanavir generic in Venezuela or in Chile, because...
And you're stating that these are terms that are written into confidential voluntary licenses.
Yeah, it's between private companies and they're non-disclosure.
And so my reaction to that is that, of course, there's a lot of things, we only know what we know because the fact that they're confidential means we don't see what's the submerged part of the iceberg. But those things are very, very difficult to monitor and combat. Most of those things are probably illegal in most jurisdictions. I would think, I'm not a lawyer, all right? So, but my simple point is that antitrust authorities in the US, in Europe, spend a lot of time and a lot of resources combating these things. Antitrust authorities in most developing countries are totally overwhelmed by these things. And what this strikes me as is an illustration of the huge asymmetry that's out there, which is that there's been a crusade to get countries to change their laws and practices to create the opportunity for this to happen by the expansion of the patent system, but there hasn't been the same crusade to get countries to build the regulatory, particularly in antitrust, capabilities to monitor and combat this. And so these things happen all the time, but they're very difficult to address. And so when I say that they're illegal, I don't know. My sense is that when put under the spotlight, many of these things would turn out to be found to be illegal under grounds of sort of abuse of being anti-competitive.
So I want to comment on the issue of substandard and counterfeit medicines. I think you're absolutely right. Latin America has improved tremendously. I'm just looking at the data here. This is from 2 years ago from USP that shows that 11.5% of samples collected from South America were substandard. Highest, greater than Africa, greater than Asia. And sort of they are largely, remember, these are not your cancer or NCD medicines. These are largely antimalarials and antibiotics. So that's a different category where the challenges are different. So this is from USP, US Pharmacopeia. And I'm happy to share that data as well. So a lot of this data, now, your point that this is not uniformly distributed is absolutely right. So I think there are better systems and worse systems that I think has to be nuanced. But there is a continuous challenge of substandard drugs, which is different than counterfeit drugs, right? So these things would have higher or lower than the API concentration. These things would have the presence of impurities, wouldn't meet the sort of the USP compendium test. So there is that challenge that does exist. And there is data that supports that, particularly for antimalarials and antibiotics. For I think some of the more high value drugs in terms of better manufacturing, which are for NCDs, I think the data from Latin America is very impressive. But for I think some of the other anti-infectives, I think there are stubborn problems that need to be addressed there. So that's the data that I was quoting. And this is published in 2016, monitoring the quality of medicines, results from Africa, Asia, and South America from people, this is from US Pharmacopeia.
We're 5 minutes behind, but I know we did start a little bit late. So if there are any last burning questions from the audience, please.
So I had asked this question on the last panel. I won't alter it too much, so my apologies for those that were here and already heard it. But just to put it out to the whole panel, whoever would like to respond, I'm curious how you view cooperation within industry, particularly through pharma associations, and how you view the sort of balance of political influence that domestic pharma associations, multinational associations, the degree of political influence that they exert, and whether you see that situation starting to change at all, whether you see governments maybe responding differently to the kind of policies where they've tried to weigh in, and whether you see governments trying to either get ahead of that or emphasize policies in different areas where maybe industry doesn't have a sort of established set of preferences, isn't as politically active, government's trying to sort of establish the rules before industry can weigh in as clearly.
Maybe our in-country representatives can talk a little bit about the relationship. Is there anything about
farmers? I can talk a lot about that. But I'm going to give you a short answer that I think is a general trend in Latin America. Oh, well, except Brazil. Like everything in Latin America is except Brazil. And that is that division between multinational companies and, like domestic industries that produce generics and so on is less useful every day. And I think it's less useful both because multinational companies are buying domestic companies, and so every day you're seeing in Argentina and in Colombia and so on that the generics producers that used to be Argentinian or Colombia are now part of a multinational company. And then the other one is because in multinational companies are every day more producing generics. So you see them playing both roles, and that you see even in Brazil, where you have progeneticos, and they have also the multinational companies playing the role of the generic producers. So I think the political economy is every day more complicated because you have the farmers. They still have the associations as if the division was so evident, but it's not so evident anymore in the policy issues, right? So I think that's something.
Yeah. In the case of Chile, there was a policy that was for innovation from the Corfo, which is the entity in Chile that leads all the efforts of innovation. And maybe it's not worth it to name the pharmaceutical, but they open a public-private entity that will allow the pharmaceutical to have house of research and development in the country. It was heavily debated because when you use the word pharmaceutical, it's, oh no, the enemies are coming, right? But I participated in some of the early negotiation of that while I was a student, and then the entity is been there for a while. And I was really surprised this morning. I had a call with the director of that facility in Chile. And it happens to be that research and development now is happening down in Chile with people from Chile, creating an ecosystem of new development right there. And it also happens that the same pharmaceutical, because we're here in Cambridge, has a research and development facility in Cambridge headquarters. Yeah. So they are creating a link between the two that has turned out pretty positive for not the selling point, which we will imagine is the profit aspect of the pharmaceutical, but for the generation of new medicine within the country. The second thing that has been a positive spin out of the pharmaceutical right there is that they're not only training people, but they are also, the government did a really good job at saying, yes, I give you the X amount of dollars, but any incentives that you give to scientists locally is not binding conditions. So go help them, but doesn't mean they're gonna, at the end of the day, sell to you, which was the big concern, and that was the government regulating that particular aspect that at the end of the day was the most important part of the deal. And they have proved wrong everyone who was skeptical. Today, for example, they're going to launch a whole study on Chilean population that nobody else would have spent the dollars on. And they have funded people to do research that wouldn't have been able to do because money wasn't there for them. So that's a positive, and it's an experiment, it's still working on, but the pharma is not always the enemy. You just need to manage it.
In Argentina, we have at least 3 or 4 enterprises who went international, and suddenly they have their production in the country, but they have 2 or 3 enterprises outside, and to do that, they went into associations with local enterprises. So, for example, in Brazil, Bagu makes an alliance to sell their products, Biocidus, and then there is Alea who also did a lot of associations. So suddenly you have enterprises that produce in the country, but then very fast they go international and they have a production in other countries. So there is some capacity of getting international liaisons, or there are some others that go to India and buy the generics directly in India, and then they bring it to the country and produce it with the license from India. So there are a lot of different, it's not so easy to just put 2 or 3 characteristics, but there are a lot of relations, and they are evolving all the time. Yeah? Okay.
Please, maybe we'll make this our last question.
Okay. Thank you for being here. I'm Jonathan Garcia from the School of Public Health here at Harvard. And I just wanted to ask you about if there's any type of experience working between Latin American countries to strengthen their systems in order to get more access or get more quality in their medicines, and if you find that is that something feasible, if you think that's useful, because so far we have been discussing about like how the FDA works with Colombia, how the Europeans are doing some other assessments on how quality is here, or maybe PAHO is working, but within between those countries, if there's any way that they can collaborate as Latin America to have better access to the medicines.
So the USP program promoting quality of medicines is about 20 years old, or even perhaps more than that. And one of their bigger successes in developing cross-country collaboration in PQM has been in Latin America. So Brazil, Argentina, Peru, I don't know Colombia, but certainly these three countries. And what it has started to do is really sort of develop at least awareness in the public sector about quality. There is still a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of better technology and technology maintenance. But if you were to look at the reports of PQM, they would point to Latin America as one of their success stories. I don't have the historical data because people didn't collect data in early 90s at the national level as it is collected now in terms of quality, but there is clear indication that the quality is improving. And among many things, part of this is sort of cross-collaboration. So, for example, US Pharmacopeia has a fairly large site in Brazil that is used also as a central training for many of these other regional partners. And that seems to be working quite well. And I don't think USP is putting a lot of money in there. A lot of it is now supported by public funds in these countries as well. So that is a sign of partnership that seems to be working reasonably well.
I think a lot is happening in the evaluation technology arena. So because technology evaluations are so expensive, countries are finding it useful to share the data or the studies, or at least have common methodologies and maybe share the cost of running a technology evaluation. So I think PAHO is promoting one network, but then there's other networks where countries, especially Latin American countries, are able to share, and that has been really useful for Central American countries, for example, that didn't develop their technology assessment bodies and so on until recently, and they have been able to use the Chilean and the Colombian and the Argentinian experiences. So that's another example.
Okay, thank you. I think with that, we'll end the formal sessions of our program. Unless, Veronica, you want to say anything else? And if there are any additional questions, we have a reception outside, and you can come and ask anyone, okay? Thank you very much.